Good evening, everybody. I think we'll get started. We've got over 400 people who are joining us already. And we're clocking nearly up to 500, which is fantastic. So I think we might formally get started. So hello, everybody, and welcome. It's fantastic to see you here at another PD in your pocket. We know that lots of you have enjoyed participating in these professional learning opportunities, and it's great to see you all here again. And we know you've had really busy days, so it's fantastic that you're here to join us. And so this is the 9th of the PD in your pocket series, brought to you by the New South Wales Family Daycare Association. So I know that many of you are keen to participate in further thinking and learning. My name is Catharine Hydon, and I will be your facilitator today. We're going to hear from amazing thinkers in this space, and we've put together a package of ideas that hopefully will inspire you to provoke learning in family daycare. Lots of really interesting ideas, lots of different ways of thinking about the work that we do together. So our opportunity today is prefaced by our acknowledgement of country. And you'll remember that we do this every single time we meet together. And I would like particularly to acknowledge the traditional owners on whose country I'm on here down in Melbourne. I'm here on the lands of the Wurrung people of the Kulin Nation. And I particularly pay my respects to elders past and present who have helped us to understand what it means to embed Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander perspectives in our everyday work with children and families. And I know that many of you are thinking about what that might look like. And this beautiful learning environment that is set up here, this gorgeous image that you can see in front of you, is some inspirational ways that you can bring elements of country into family daycare settings. And of course, I know that you're all on many different lands of different traditional owners, and it's important that you take a moment now just to acknowledge the traditional owners on whose country you're on. If you're not sure about whose country you're on, it might be something that you want to look up and maybe ask a few people in your community if they know on whose country you're on. Maybe ask your family daycare team, they might know, and it's a great way to introduce those ideas to children as well. And of course, we know that the lands that we're on always were and always will be Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander land. So important things that we do when we gather together in these sorts of opportunities. So as I said, today is an opportunity for you to engage in a conversation around provoking learning in family daycare. Lots of different things we can talk about in relation to that. And it's important also that there's an opportunity for you to engage in some of the pre-thinking before today. So I know that lots of you are on the Facebook page. I've seen lots of you on there, so please continue to have those conversations. I know Lisa, who put together all of these packages, is really enthusiastic about your participation in that space. Share some of your insights, share some of your thinking. And of course, there's pre-reading and a great booklet that you would have participated and had access to before today. So again, have a look at some of the information that's on there. Check out the website that's up on the screen at the moment. If you haven't been engaging in that, go in there and have a look and see all of the resources that are attached to this. I know that some of you also will be engaging with this in a podcast form, so you won't be seeing it, but you'll be listening to it, and hopefully that's a great way for you to continue to think about some of the things that are being raised today and some of the ways that you can incorporate them into your everyday conversations with children and their families. And of course, there's further reading. So great that you're actually able to continue thinking about further reading and continue the conversations. And can I really point out, very importantly, really something that's very important to this PD in your pocket process is that you complete the survey. So we really want you to complete that because, of course, that gives us information about what you really like, what you found interesting, what you would like more of. And of course, we can talk to the department in here in New South Wales to talk about the sorts of things that you would like to see more of and you would like to see more access to. So please let the team know exactly what you are interested in, and you can do that via the survey. So we'll tell you a little bit more about that and remind you again about that at the conclusion of today's opportunity. And of course, if you've got any questions or you want to know anything else, please email the team at Family Daycare New South Wales because they're ready to answer your questions. You can put a question into the Facebook page as well, but lots of opportunities for you to engage and think a little bit more about some of the ideas. Again, the booklet, really good way to re-engage with some of the ideas we talk about today. So if you've got an idea that you would want to think more about, go back into the booklet, have a bit of a look there. And of course, lots of interesting readings that you can do as a result of our participation today. So let's keep going and talk a little bit more about what we're going to be talking about today, because lots of ideas and lots of ways for you to think about connecting them to your everyday practice, and for you to think about stretching your everyday practice. So as we go, I know the people who are listening to a podcast might not be able to do this as much, but everybody else who's joining us live today, you might be able to just take a few notes about the things that you're interested in. You might want to post a question or two in the chat. We'll do our best to sort of have a look at that and see whether there's particular questions. So we really love to hear from you as we proceed. So what are we going to cover tonight? We're going to talk a lot about the ways in which provocation is an important part of the design and implementation of your learning experiences for young children. In the booklet that you were sent, it explains some of the basics of provoking learning. So you would have hopefully got a bit of a sense of that. But we're also aware that some educators use a range of learning setups. For some people, the concept of provocation is new. So it's a bit about setting up spaces, lots about your role in that. So we're going to talk a bit about what is provocation, what does it look like, what is it, how can we explain it so you're clear about it, how to implement it in your own settings, why is it a good idea to provoke learning in young children in your family daycare setting, and what's the rationale for that. These are helpful if you're talking to families about what you're doing. You might be talking to your colleagues about what you're doing. You could be explaining it to children. Why are you setting up experiences like that? And of course, we practically want to talk about how you go about it. So I want to give you lots of inspirational ideas. And we're going to show you some images that'll be really helpful for you to have a look at. Hopefully, as a result of this, you get a little bit of inspiration, and maybe you can try something tomorrow, set something up, or it might actually invite you to think a little bit more about some of the things that you've spent a bit of time thinking about before, but maybe haven't had the information you need to progress those ideas. So a little bit of inspiration hopefully would be part of this conversation. So before we do anything else, let's talk about what it means to provoke. So that word is a really interesting word here, and it's connected to this idea of provocation. So it's the sort of the underpinning idea. So to promote learning, or to provoke learning, I should say, it means to provide a stimulus, the stimulus that we need to learn. It's sort of the nudge that children need to get them to a point when they're involved and more in learning, and we get them to this space where they're learning new things. It's to provide an environment or the motivation to learn. So it's about exciting children to learn. It's about inspiring them to learn. And really importantly, of course, it's inspiring them to think differently, to be curious. So many of the things, of course, that we provide with to children in everyday family daycare settings do exactly that. And they don't have to be complicated or expensive materials. We'll talk a little bit more about this, but there's lots and lots of ways we can provoke learning. Different provocations that different educators use on a daily basis are part of your toolkit. It's a part of the things that you do as an educator. And tonight we're going to look at the ways in which you can provoke learning in your early childhood setting, in your family daycare setting. We're going to look at the guide to the NQS. We're going to have a bit of a think about that, particularly when it asks us what adaptations can be made to the environment, or additional resources can we use to provoke interest and creativity, sustained shared thinking. That's when we think together with children, and collaborative learning where we're all participating. And I'm sure all of you can remember a day with the young children that you work with, and indeed maybe your outside school hours children too, where you've set up an environment and children immediately go there. They're drawn to it. They're inspired by it. They want to get involved in it. That's what we mean by provoking learning. There's something going on there in terms of provoking learning. And we want to, and in fact, I think sometimes you can actually see children get sparked into curiosity by some of the things that you create. I remember a day when I brought in some materials some tools that came out of my grandfather's shed. So some of you have got some of those sorts of things, and they were old hammers and some things, and they were in a big box that he made, and I brought them to show the children, and we set up a space where children could investigate them. And I remember children being incredibly curious because I don't think they'd ever seen anything quite like that. You might have resources and materials in your own home that actually provoke children to be interested and excited to learn something new. They can be precious things that you ask children to look after very carefully, but it can be an opportunity to really invite them into that space. But if we think that provocation is this invitation to be a part of ideas and curiosity and to stretch children's thinking, get them to think with you and to collaborate with you, to draw children in, we should think about why we need to do that. So what is it about providing an environment like that, some experiences like that, that are really important for children's learning? And again, we've talked a little bit about the National Quality Standard and the expectations in that space. But broadly, early childhood education is an opportunity for us to provoke and inspire children to learn so that they understand what it means and feels like to be curious. So to provoke learning means to provide a stimulus that children need to learn, to provide an environment that is motivational, so it motivates them to learn, to step into that space. There are many ways to do that and many opportunities that you can create to make that happen. So one of the things that we want to investigate more is the why behind that. And I think it's important for us to think about the various reasons that that's the case. So in the first instance, we want to think about supporting children to think. I said that before. I think that's a really important thing to remember. And if you think about the times we live in, then we need thinkers, we need problem solvers, we need children to be able to look at something and go, I wonder how I can use that. So there's lots of children who need support to be able to engage in those processes. We know that children learn more in their early years, much, much more than the rest of their lives. So 85%, some of you will know this from some of the things that you've read, 85% of brain development occurs before children are 5. So children are really primed to learn. And because children learn when they are interested and curious, they'll learn more when there's more materials and resources, experiences, the things that are inviting them to think and be exposed to doing different things. So we don't want to ask them what to do, so in a very formulaic way or a formal way or a closed-ended way. We want them to think using creative materials. It also makes teaching and learning interesting. So for you as family daycare educators, it makes it exciting. When children are excited and interested, it makes your job much more exciting and much more interested. So it's good for you as well. And of course, it's a requirement of the Early Years Learning Framework, My Time, Our Place, and the National Quality Framework, National Quality Standard. So those of you who know those documents well, which I'm sure is all of you, you've all read those multiple times. You might want to go back into those and have a bit of a look after a result of today, because you think, oh, I wonder where those things are in the practices and principles of My Time, Our Place and the Early Years Learning Framework. So, for example, the National Quality Standard asks us in educational program and practice to make sure that we provide an educational program that is stimulating and engaging. It enhances children's learning and development, and lots of things in that space tell us about using children's current knowledge and their strengths and their ideas and their culture and their abilities to be able to create interesting programs for them. So things that relate to them, so that are reflective of their cultural background. So many of you will have the opportunity to do that because you share the same cultural background as children. And others of you might be able to share some elements of your cultural background with children who don't know anything about it yet. So you are someone who can really inspire the children to be able to investigate new ideas. Think of all the things that you have in your own home that might be really stimulating and exciting for children to get access to. Educators also need to respond to children's ideas. So this is when children start to create different ways of using materials and resources. They might take the materials from one place to another place. It's really important that they get to bring them back, because that's a really respectful thing to do. So you could support them with that. But support children to be able to investigate new ideas, open-ended interactions, open-ended questions, opportunities to extend children's thinking are all part of the expectations of the National Quality Framework. So lots of reasons for you to engage in this. And actually, we know it works. We know this works. It makes for a dynamic and vibrant and exciting and engaging family daycare education and care context. Children will want to be there. Families will want their children to be there. Children will talk about how exciting it is to be in your place, because there's lots of things to be inspired and engaged in. And this is what we want children to be talking about in terms of their interactions with you. Of course, relationships absolutely play a significant role. as do the opportunities for children to learn new things in exciting and engaging spaces. So we should now say, if that's the reason, we should investigate a little bit more about what is provocation. So we should talk about it a bit more so that you're really clear about it, because I think sometimes that word is a really big word, but it's really good to be able to expand our knowledge. So it's about wonder and joy, and it's about an opportunity for children to engage in interesting things. So I feel like we can be very excited about this space. So it calls forth the opportunity for stimulation and responses, and it ought to push a little bit. Push is probably not the right word, is it? It might extend and inspire children. It provokes new ways of thinking. It's designed to expand and extend children's own unique ideas and interests and theories by introducing things that perhaps they don't know anything about yet, and they can think about them in really creative ways. When an educator deliberately observes and uses the knowledge that they have about children and the world in which they live, they create opportunities for provocation. So it's based on children's wonderings and ponderings. You know, children are always thinking about things, and they're always trying to think about the ways that resources and materials fit together. So they want to be able to investigate. So one of the things is a great quote here that I want to share with you with some really interesting ways of thinking about it. So Sally Jorge and Nicole, I'm not sure what her name is, they say that provocation is engaging in a process that activates children's thinking. It provides children with new experiences and connections in their pursuits of ideas and interests and theories. A provocation challenges children to go to the next level of thinking. So provocation should encourage children to come up with ideas and theories, not just the ideas of the educator. It's about ideas and interests that are their own and collaboration with others so that they can start to generate new ways of understanding the world. It's about you trying to manage different parts. There's lots of people who are thinking about this loose parts ideas where there are different things you can move to one place or the other. But essentially, it's about children thinking and imagining new ideas and trying out things with the resources that you provide for them. Now, interesting to think here, you might not actually know where exactly children are going to go with an idea, but the materials and resources are out for children to explore in really meaningful ways, hands-on, sometimes body in, as a way to be able to experience those things. It might sound a little bit complex, but it's really important that we recognise that often provocations are already in your day-to-day programs. You might already be incorporating some of these ideas. Provocations are thoughtfully planned stations or experiences. They might be on the floor, they might be in your backyard, they might be on a table, they might be set up in a little space, they might be little areas that invite children to come in. We often call those learning experience areas. We might call them activities that you might draw children into. The notion of activity sometimes means that they sort of end, but you might want to have something that goes on for a long period of time. So you might call it more of a learning experience or a learning space where children are invited to be a part of. But it does require educators to set things up, to have a setup or, establishing a space where children feel comfortable to be able to go into those spaces, engage in the materials and resources, rearrange them in ways that make sense to them, and then start to build new ideas using those materials. The idea is to get them to think and to wonder and to explore and to build conversations, to talk about the things that they're thinking in their first or second or third language, to be able to be curious about the things that they're talking to you about, and start to make connections with what they know and what they're seeing in front of them so they can explore and make new ideas. So that's sort of aim of this. So we want to be able to set up those experiences that invite children into that. A long time ago, I used to work at a multicultural resource centre down here in Melbourne. And one of the things that we used to do a lot, we used to talk about inviting spaces. This is what we mean by provocation. They invite you to think, they invite you in. And one of the things that's great about that for children, particularly from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds, is that means that they can bring their own cultural identity, their own language into that space, and it will always be right. So it'll always meet the needs of the individual children, which is an important thing to think about as you're setting up spaces for children. So let's just think a little bit more about the spaces that we might create. So it is very fundamentally about setting up spaces that invite children, that provoke thinking. So this is a picture, beautiful and interesting picture. There's lots of images here, so you might want to have a think about that. Which image would you like to maybe replicate or play around with or do a little version of in the next little while? So just remember which ones you like the best, and if you like it, then it's probably likely that children will too. So here's a picture of a provocation. Look at the elements of it. So it's really important that we look at all the different parts of it. You can see the different elements here. I'm just looking at this, my screen here, looking at all the different parts. Can you see various parts of this? There's lots of open-ended experiences to explore. Is it one that also invites children to think rather than do? So you can see there's a basket in the background. There's two baskets in the background, and there's a jar of pencils. Can you see that? And a mirror. Oh, two mirrors. A bit of maybe that's one mirror with a frame. Lots of little beads there for them to work on, and you can think here, does it control what children have to use the materials for? Is there a particular predetermined destination? Does it have the opportunity to predict and predetermine what's happening, or is it open-ended? Does it tell the child what to do, or does it invite them to be stimulated by the materials that are provided to take them in different directions? So this is a really good example of a lot of different things happening. And you might be thinking, I wonder what age group might like to engage with this. I think this would be appropriate for children who are 3 to 5 years old. Some 2-year-olds might be able to engage in things like this. Obviously, you've got to be careful of some of these materials because there might be a choking hazard. So you have to do some little thinking about risk assessment there, about the sorts of resources that you use for different age groups of children. But something like this might take children in lots and lots of different directions. Children can take these ideas where they want. They can use their skills of curiosity, exploration, planning, invention. They can do all sorts of different things with these sorts of resources. You can imagine that this might be set up in a little quieter space that you have, maybe with one chair or they could stand. That would be a really good idea too. You could put some of the things like the flowers in the background there. It could be different collections of materials that open up to for a space for children to think. It's often also an opportunity for children to engage in design, so they can design different spaces and different thinking in relation to those ideas. So let's keep going and think about some other examples. Now, if the one that I just showed you is an open-ended space, so let me just go back there so you can see. Open-ended, lots of different possibilities there. The materials are not telling you exactly what to do. If you go into something like this, it's what I would consider to be the opposite of that. So this is much more like a closed experience, a closed-ended, predetermined experience. You have already, mostly it's going to be the adult, who's already decided what the destination would look like, and children simply comply. So children will learn something from that. They'll learn about following instructions, how to use the scissors, how to use the needle, follow directions, which is actually okay. So that's not terrible. But we want to more and more give children an opportunity to think, because in the 21st century, that's what we need. We need thinkers, we need problem solvers, we need children who are creative to think about how to solve wicked problems in the world. So we want to be able to help children think. So closed experiences are fine for some things, but if we can do more of the provocation type of experiences where children are thinking and they're opening up their brain and they're exploring different possibilities, it's going to be much more important for them as learners. And you'll, of course, know that the early years learning framework is pretty clear about the expectations of children becoming confident and involved learners. I want to propose to you that these types of experiences don't get you there as in a meaningful way. These are often things that sometimes are designed by us as educators, not necessarily children. Now, sometimes it's possible to turn these into learning experiences that are more about a provocation. So you can use scissors and needles in a way that might support children to think about different ways, but get them to be involved in the design of things, get them to think about what they would like to do, get them to solve problems. So it's good to compare the two so that you get a sense of what the two different ones look like. So, and here's another example of a quite closed experience. Now, increasingly in early childhood education and care, we are not using stencils and these sorts of formal learning experiences. It's not what we would think about as best practice in early childhood education and care. And lots of the things that you will read in My Time, Our Place and in the Early Years Learning Framework and the National Quality Standard encourage you to think about different types of things rather than a stencil type of closed experience that is pretty much predetermined. Now, some children might enjoy these from time to time. That's okay. A parent might bring them along. A child might choose some of those. But if you, for the most part, can offer children really strong experiences that are about stimulating their thinking and imagination and creativity, then that will be more consistent with some of the expectations of the Early Years Learning Framework and the National Quality Standard. And I know some of you are sitting here going, okay, so I think I get it, the difference between the two. So you remember the open-ended space with the little bits and pieces on the mirror and all those different ways of thinking about setting up an experience that might stimulate children's thinking. You can do it, of course, with paintbrushes and all sorts of different materials, the resources, dramatic play, so all sorts of different things that open up a space for children to think. And if you're pretty clear now that the closed experiences are very much about closed off destination already pre-prescribed, I'm sure you're asking questions about, so how do you do it? So worksheets and craft activities, for example, that are designed to make a set product or are different from provocations because one provides open-ended experiences and one more leads children to a space that's predetermined, and one opens up children for experimentation. So provocation's success depends on the thought that the educator puts into the activity. So designing the spaces and the materials and resources is reliant on you to think through what you're going to do and how you're going to set those things up. The educator groups the resources, sets up the spaces, chooses the way that they'll be grouped together, the containers they'll be in, the baskets and how they're set up, to help children to think and wonder, to recreate and create. It's an opportunity for children and you to be willing to allow children to experiment and follow their own interests and ideas with support from you, to think differently from what an educator might think and define the provocations in a way that stimulates learning. Provocations are designed with great thought by an educator to extend children's learning. So we choose materials that are supportive of that extension of learning. The educator might group them together and also support children to take these ideas where they want to go, to use their skills, scissors cutting, etc., and help them to also use the dispositions for learning that they have, like curiosity, exploration, planning, invention, and you might think of other resources that they need along the way, which is a great role for an educator to support children. The concept of provocation is used lots in different early childhood education and care settings, and we have been supported from our colleagues in Reggio Emilia in the northern part of Italy, who have explored this idea for a long time and have thought lots about the ways in which they can support children to think. There's some significant things you can read about that in the booklet, is some ideas there, and lots of links to further reading that you can have a look at. So if you're interested in that, there's lots of different ways for you to explore those ideas further. Of course, it's important too to think about the ways we understand the role of the educator. So in designing curiosity and wonder, it's important that we think about the joys of wonder that brings to children, and thinking about the ways that educators inspire children to provoke and ask questions about how and who and why. There is something that is a lot easier to do with children because it's many experiences that are fresh and inspiring to them. So what do we mean by that? Imagine if one day a child entered your home and instead of the normal hallway, they had to enter through a series of boxes linked to a tunnel. Or imagine that the lights were off and the curtains were closed and there was a projection of a butterfly on the wall. What would they think? And imagine if there was a gigantic cubby in the lounge room with fairy lights. So many of you, of course, are doing things like this, and you're thinking about the ways that you can engage children in the delight and joy of experiences that are different from what they are expecting. So think about how you can provoke wonder in children and curiosity. How can they investigate things in your home? Why did you do it? Why did you put a box there? Why would you make a space where children can crawl through tunnels? Are tunnels only for children? Why do the butterflies have colourful wings? All these different conversations can come out of one different experience that you offer to children, which is very different and sparks curiosity and wonder from educators. So linking this joy and wonder to a specific provocation is easy. There's lots of different things to talk about. So there's lots of room for you as educators to be able to stimulate children's thinking, lots to talk about. Think about a topic of the provocation and interest, the experience that you want to consider for children, and think about the ways you can support them with some inspirational ideas to motivate and stimulate their curiosity and wonder. So think of something that really is of interest to you now and think about different ways you can present that idea to children. So we want to continue to think a little bit about the different spaces, the how, your role in all of this. So how would your children react to this type of provocation? A good provocation inspires curiosity and wonder, as we've said. It inspires children to think rather than do. It inspires them to ask questions about the how and the why and the who. It helps them to think. It helps them to explore. And it gives them an opportunity to experiment with ideas. So light is such a lovely term. We could talk about that all day, about how children are deeply drawn to different lights. And some of these can be very safely included into your learning environment in exactly this type of image. So experiment with some of those ideas. And of course, for very young children, light is really interesting too. So lots of things to experiment with there. And some of you will get inspiration from your fellow early childhood educators. You might be seeing something online, or these ideas might give you a spark of ideas so that you can stimulate, you can put something in your own spaces that reflect some of the conversations we're having today. And here's another one. So here's some other ones that we can have a look at. Here's a really interesting one. I love the idea here of using shadow. This is with an overhead projector. Some of you might have an overhead projector. If you do, hold on to it. But if you don't, you can just use a light and shine the light on the wall like this and give children an opportunity to be able to use shadows, their own bodies. And I wonder how the children that you work with would react to light and using light and shadow in this way. Put pieces of paper up there. Children can experiment with those ideas, particularly colour and light is always really intriguing. Again, children can be drawn to light in lots of different ways. And here's another one. Beautiful setup here. And you can see, I think these are tiles. So just white tiles. I'm sure they would have got them from an interesting space. Maybe you can recycle them from somewhere. And look at the way that they've set up that with beautiful textures and all ready to go, and set up with the beautiful flowers in those jars. Now, if some of you are thinking, oh, I don't know whether my children would like that or whether that's okay, of course we support children to be able to use these resources and materials in ways that are safe and supportive. So I want to make sure that we're doing those things at the same time. But it's also about teaching children how to use these resources. Now, lots of these opportunities in family daycare might be for smaller groups of children. You might set up that for one child. You might have a mirror. You might have a range of textures all set up in different colours. That's another way of doing it. But I love the idea of bringing nature into this space and giving children opportunities to respond to those sorts of natural materials. Really interesting idea. Again, another really beautiful invitation, again, using light, you can see there, and images that might provoke children to be able to engage in the resources. I do think at some point the idea of provocation and setting up provoking spaces is about respect. There's about respecting children and providing children with beautiful spaces that they engage in. They don't have to be perfect, but they have to be inviting. And when I look at this, I want to go and play with those things. I want to be a part of that. So it's a beautiful way to use clay, set up clay so that's ready to go for each individual child. And here's another really fantastic idea. Again, light. The light is a really interesting idea to use. And some of you have probably used something like this. Sheer cloths of some description are really helpful because you can still see children whilst they think they're enclosed in something in a secretive space. So a lovely idea there too. But I love the idea of a canopy like that. You can do that with a box, or you can do with a bit of a frame. So lots of you can think very, very creatively about the spaces that you've set up. Great to be able to see examples, and if you've got really great ideas, please share them with your colleagues in the chat. I can see lots of you are still chatting in the chat, which is fantastic, so keep sharing some ideas in that space. So what we want to do now is keep those conversations going about some really simple ideas. So I want to just share with you some simple ideas and just talk through those, because I think there's lots of different ways you can do this. And hopefully some of these will help you think about how you might do it. Now, some of these, of course, come from centre-based programs. So if you have a look at those, you might go, I wonder how I can do it in my family daycare setting. So you might think, well, what tables have I got? What chairs have I got? What mirrors have I got? In fact, I've just went through my shed the other day and got a fantastic mirror, and it's a really great one, nice and heavy, so it's very stable, and you could put that on the floor and you could replicate some of these things. So mirrors are really interesting resources. Think about the ways you can recycle materials. Ask the families about the things that you can get from them. So simple provocations, set up ideas that will help children to explore and experiment with the materials that they've given. I love this idea here with having spaces set up for children. That's really fantastic. And bowls of resources where children get to play with those. Very good to be able to stimulate thinking, and I love the mirror too. So children are designing and creating spaces that and ideas and designs that help them think and make sense of the world. And of course, at the same time, learning fantastic mathematical skills and literacy skills in that process. So as you're observing them, you can watch what children are doing in terms of the learning that they're creating. And here's another really interesting idea. Don't you just want to play with this? I love the color coordination too. It's amazing and carefully created. And you can see that for older children, 3 to 4 year olds and 5-year-olds, and even children in outside school hours programs too. They might be really interested in being able to use this. So think about the types of learning that educators want to achieve with this. So you can see there's numbers on the pebbles. So there's a lot of number work going on here, but not in a formulaic way where there is a sheet of paper that children have to complete. It's much more of a thinking process. You can see how children might use those ideas to design different things. You might need to support children a little bit with this process to help them understand their what to do with the materials. But at some point too, you might be saying, children don't need my support. They can actually work together to do some things or create different ways of using those materials. Here's an interesting experience with words. So perhaps your older children might like to use these ideas in a really creative way. And some of our colleagues in primary education use similar types of techniques to inspire children to learn about words. And you probably got some children, perhaps a little bit older, who really like that, who enjoy those sorts of experiences. And of course, you can do these in languages other than English. So there's a whole range of different possibilities here. So sometimes educators will set up invitations for children like this one. The educator wants to invite them to learn particular things and use resources in a particular way. And to think about those things a bit creatively, giving children leeway to be able to think about different ways of using those resources and materials. They might take all those little fairy balls and think of something different to do with it. So again, following their lead a bit, but also supporting them to learn and to create different spaces. So here's another thing that you probably are familiar with. Imagine if you noticed that 1 or 2 children in your family daycare program were very interested in dinosaurs. You could purchase a set of plastic dinosaurs like this one, right? So you've probably seen lots of things like this. You've seen them online and you've seen them in catalogues. But I wonder if we had explored it in a different way and maybe even had some pretend play with it, so some dramatic play. The dinosaurs could go much further to provoking children to learn. Will it really, these sorts of experiences, spark the curiosity that we've been thinking about? Is there another way you can do that? And again, you might want to be thinking about different things you can do with dinosaurs, like these sorts of things. So here's an interesting way you can use some of those particular creatures, that you might get, but use them in different ways. This sort of shadow work is really interesting. Invite children to think about these sorts of things. Take a single dinosaur, take it outside, position it so that you can see a shadow, and then draw the shadow. Some really interesting work there. You could actually do that with a lot of different things and go out and about into your community and see what else is out there. You might also like to think a bit broadly about that and set up learning experiences whereby you bring one resource like blocks, and meet them with things like the dinosaurs, the plastic dinosaurs. The spaces that you create could be combinations. So what happens if you took them into the sand or the water? So how else could they use those exact same materials? So lots of different ways to think about those ideas. And of course, images like this just really give you lots of different ideas as well. What a stimulating learning environment this is. And I said before, this is an overhead projector. Some of you know what that looks like. You'll remember that. But I wonder if we set up them very differently, if they saw the shapes up large on the screen up there. And also a simple set of those materials might not be a closed-ended experience, but they might open up to a whole range of different things. So actually it's worth going back and having a look at the resources and materials that you have and say, I wonder if I could use that differently. You might have a tea set. I wonder how I can use that differently. You might have some soft toys. How can I use those differently? You might have some dinosaurs, plastic dinosaurs. How can I use them differently? You might have some beads. How can I use those differently? How can I use them in a way to provoke children's thinking? So, of course, that is in resources and materials, but there's lots of different things you can do with art as well. So really interesting ways to set up art experiences, and we know that children love those spaces. So this setup is just very inviting. Do you want to go and play there? I absolutely do. So look at this. This is outside, gorgeous space. The resources and materials are all ready to go. You would, of course, need to support children to understand how to play with these resources, but this is a fantastic inspiration. You can see the book there and the pencils and all those other things set up there to create children's opportunities for learning. And of course, you can go back, children can go back to this. You would have something like this set up on a long-term basis so that children get opportunity to revisit it over time. And children, and because you're in beautiful small groups in family daycare, there's lots of different things you can do to add to materials over time and keep those ideas stretching and growing, add more complex materials over time. So here's another beautiful one where educators have set up this based on a colour experience. I love this, just black and white. So really interesting ways. Now, again, same thing. You might look at this and say, this is much more designed for my older children. Now, if we think about opportunities for very young children, that's about materials and resources that might have different expectations in them. But again, think about the children you've got, think about the work that you do, think about the spaces you're creating. But lots of terrific things here. And I love the fact that it's got a book in the background there, and there's lovely glass jars with lids on them so that you can set it up, leave it, come back to it over time, which is a really great way of encouraging children to extend their learning over time. So repetition is a really important one. Or this one, look, a cherry blossom. They've got beautiful images there. I think they might have downloaded those from the internet, some beautiful things out there, some sticks and some ways to be able to create some of those things yourself, and really beautiful ways to inspire children. So you can use images from the world in which you live. You can use photos. You can take some photos and bring them in. You can obviously take children out and about to have a look at things, collect their own resources as well. So a lovely way of setting that up. Truly inspirational. You could do a variation of this very easily. So let's keep going and think of some more, because there's such lovely things to look at. So let's just say that you've noticed a group of children who are getting excited about a bird's nest. So let's see what we could do with that over time. So you can see that we've got an opportunity here. So if you found a beautiful stained glass mobile in a garage sale, you could find it there, and you thought, I'll bring that and I'll share that with the children. And then you might say, what else could I notice here? There might be something else that you see. You might find a book in the library. You might also find a couple of books that you have in your collection that are about birds' nests. So you could set that up and add that to your space. And then you could find a bit of artwork, or you could think about an image or two that you might have found that supports the work that around birds' nests. So you're building up sort of some of the ideas here. And then you might have your iPad open and you could have a look a little bit about birds' nests. This is a lovely one about children making their own, birds making their nests out of all these found materials. And of course, this week is a bird tracking week. So there's lots of bird counts going on in backyards. You could add that to your repertoire as well. And then you could think about making your own bird's nests in that sort of with that inspiration. And you could find lots of different resources and materials that help you to construct your own bird's nest. Here's a beautiful collection of resources and materials that people have brought together. And now you remember the joy that we talked about in terms of provocation, that you don't need to suggest children that what they do, but let them explore the materials in different ways using the internet and books and things like the mobile as stimulation to support children to think and investigate and research. They might want to think about how materials might be used, and you set it up and you open up that opportunity for children to explore what those resources are. They might just want to use those resources to tidy up the space. They also might want to think about how they sort them. What do you think the children that you work with would do with them? Have you given them time and the space to be able to research some of the materials that you are investigating? So who knows, there'll be things for you to think about there. And you, of course, know your children best, so you'll be able to think about what that might look like. And of course, here's a great example of some of the work that children might be doing. So you might be doing some collection of thinking with them. And here's in this example, of course, it looks much more closed-ended. It's you could cut them all out and you could decide what they look like. And you could also have lots of different bird's nests that look exactly the same. So one of the things that you want to do is have a think about whether I'm going to go down this path with lots of different things that might stimulate children, or I'm going to go down this path which is much more closed, much more activities that don't necessarily take children into an exploration space. Now, of course, you could provide materials like this and then leave it to children to explore ideas rather than everybody doing exactly the same bird's nest. So there's ways to take some of the ideas you have and open them up to opportunities for children to explore and do something different with the resources. So that's lots of different opportunities for you to think about different ways of setting up those spaces. It would be important for us to think also about your role in all of this. So you are a really important person in all of this. You, of course, gather the materials and you bring children to sit together with you. And it's important that we think about your role in all of this. You could do all of those things for them. You could design everything for them. You could make sure that every single child does exactly the same thing. Or you could open up to be the type of educator who stimulates children and makes sure that every child is participating in a provocation space. And it's really important that we think about the role of the educator using provocation, and that you are making sure that you are part of a conversation with children that stimulates their thinking. So the role of the educator is to think carefully about the provocations that they are setting up. So that's your first job as an educator, is to think a lot. Think about who you've got. Take some observations about the children that you work with. And as a family daycare educator, you need to think carefully also about the types of opportunities that you would include for provocation that respond to individual children's needs and their rights, and that making sure that children are focused. You focus your efforts on the children that you have with you. You need to think about whether the provocation is for the whole group or for the individual group, to be able to set up the times to engage in some thinking about past experiences and what you might do in the future. And once you've imagined the provocation in your head, you need to work out what that might look like and how you set up spaces that are built on curiosity and wonder. How would you use it if you came upon it yourself? What would you do? How would you be inspired to learn? How you'd be inspired to investigate the materials? What would you ask yourself? What would you want to find out? So some of these questions, these reflective practice questions, are a really important role for educators to think about. And once children are engaged, then you also have a job of observation. You want to observe children in that space so that you learn more about how they're engaging with that material. And you may want to also modify the material so that next time children engage with them, they learn more, and you can become a co-researcher with children. So it's important that educators think a little bit about your role. If an educator's job if an educator's job is not just to set up the provocation, but to become a co-researcher with children. So you want to be part of the opportunity to think with children, to build some scaffolding around children, to support them, to test their ideas, test their theories, to think with you about how they solve problems in those particular spaces. So join in with them. It's a really important part of what you do. And of course, the provocation often starts from children's interests, so the children might share with something, or you might actually want to share something with children as well, so your interest or children's interests, and children show an interest in something, you join in, you listen carefully, you observe that interest, you work out what you would like to support children to explore, what ideas you would like to support children to explore, how you would like to stretch their thinking, and then the educator then sets up the provocation, the space, to entice children to explore the ideas further and to engage and test their theories. So children then develop more and more skills in that space. So lots of different opportunities here for educators to become really planned in the way that they respond to children's interests in this space, and to provide provocations for their continued thinking. Some educators will be used to giving children opportunities for worksheets and things that are much more formulaic. So we want to really challenge that and invite you to think about different ways of doing things. Worksheets, unfortunately, can only be used in one way. There's pretty much one way you can do those. They're colouring in books and things like that lead children to think that there's only a single way to do things, and they require little, if any, of higher order thinking and creativity. So we want to use less of those and more of the experiences that we've talked about. Our goal as professional educators is to be an opportunity for encouraging children to think in different ways, divergent thinking. And provocations can be powerful tools to help children to develop activities that will encourage the higher order thinking and exploration of problem solving and creativity, like we've talked a lot about. So once you start observing children and co-researching with them, joining with them in their thinking process, it's amazing how much you can provoke learning. So start little and then keep thinking about new ideas as you explore them. And one of the great things we're going to do now is be joined by someone who's going to think a little bit more with the amazing Lisa Bryant, who's going to interview Deborah Harcourt from Asia Pacific Early Childhood Consultants. She's done a lot of research over the years, and Deborah's a really important thinker in our space who can explore some more ideas around provocation. Once you've heard from Deborah, then I'll come back and we'll conclude our session today. And as I'm talking, the amazing Wendy in the background here is going to share the video that we're going to use and that you'll be able to have a look at. And remember, you can go back and have a look at this a bit later as well. So we're now going to have a look at the video interview with Lisa and Deborah. Thanks, Wendy. Wendy, I wonder whether you're there. Are you able to share your video with us?
I'm here. I'm just having a couple of little issues. I won't be a moment.
No worries.
Sorry,
everybody,
guys.
Bear with us, everybody. We're just getting some technical things sorted. Wendy's going to share the video with us just in a little minute, but I see that quite a number of you have shared a couple of ideas as well. Oh, someone has put in here, they're going bushwalking tomorrow, and they're going to take crayons and do some crayon rubbing, and they're also going to take magnifying glasses. What a fantastic thing to do. So thank you for those of you who have shared your ideas. The bird's nest idea has got a bit of support, lots of people supporting that idea, and bringing in those resources and inviting children to think in different ways using those sorts of resources. And some people have also said, check out social media and check out some of the things that are online, because there's lots of things to inspire you in that space. So think about different found experiences. Some of you have said also check out, talk to families about the types of materials that they might have been able to share with you. Lots of you also have said how important it is to get resources like lighting and things like that, recycled materials, lots of different options in that space. And some of you also have said how good that shadow drawing is, and some of you have done some of things like that. So keep sharing some of those ideas, because I think it's great to hear from your colleagues about the things that have worked for you. And for some of you online at the moment, you might be thinking, I have to maybe change some of the things that I've been doing in the past. It may be quite a big change for you, but for others of you, it's just a little tiny change that you can make to something that you've already provided that helped to spark new ideas and new creativity. So any minute now, we're going to be watching the video. Here it comes, everybody. So here we go, and over to Deborah Harcourt in our interview with Lisa Bryant.
Hello, I'm really, really pleased to be able to introduce everyone to Deborah Harcourt. And Deborah's got many descriptions and backgrounds that we could put on, but the one that, attracted me to have her for this session is where she calls herself an investigator of the provocations of Reggio Emilia and translator of these to the Australian context. Is that a fair idea of a good description for what it is that you do?
Yes, I think so, Lisa, and thank you so much for having me today. It's an absolute pleasure to talk with you again. I guess it comes from many years of reading about Reggio, engaging in dialogue with colleagues. But I guess in 2012, 2013, I was incredibly lucky to be a part of the South Australian Thinker in Residence, where the Premier, Jay Weatherall, at the time invited Professor Carla Rinaldi to come to Adelaide on and off for about 2 years. And I had the great privilege of working side by side with her. And in discussing the principles and the provocations from Reggio Emilia, it really came home to me that you just can't pick them up and plonk them somewhere else. So this was an opportunity for me to see if I could translate them into another context. Having worked in Singapore for 10 years, I had the opportunity to also understand what these might look like in a Chinese context, in an Indian context, in a Middle Eastern context, in an Indonesian context, and then coming back to Australia, really trying to unpack with colleagues what they might look like in our context, whether it be family daycare, long daycare, or kindergarten.
Okay, so let's go back, because some of the educators that will be watching this will be very aware of what Reggio Emilia is, and others will be going, what's that? What are they talking about? So can you just give a very short, and I know it's hard whenever you ask anyone to talk about Reggio Emilia to make it short, but give a very short understanding of what that is, where it is.
Well, basically, Lisa, it's a group of 32 infant and toddler centres and preschools that are situated in the city of Reggio Emilia. So Reggio Emilia is not a person, and Reggio is not married to Emilia. So it is actually a city. And it was born after the Second World War, where parents and families and community were looking for something different away from state-run early learning centres and away from the church. So a group of families came together and sold off, apparently, some of the trucks and the armoured vehicles that were left after the Second World War to fund the start of a preschool. And a few years after that, a man called Loris Malaguzzi, who was based in Rome, who was actually born in a little town near Reggio called Correggio, was really attracted, being a developmental psychologist and an educational psychologist, was really attracted to some of the principles that they were working on. So it's a group of centres that are world-renowned, I guess mostly around their image of child and their focus on the rights of children.
And when I first suggested this topic for this particular PD in a pocket, everyone went, like some of the family daycare people I suggested to said, what does provocation mean? They weren't used to that word. So can you explain what provocations are, and then maybe we can go on to what's the difference between provocations and invitations?
Well, actually, Lisa, that's where I was going to start, because it reminded me of a conversation a couple of years ago in Melbourne, where there were some colleagues from Reggio Emilia who were out for a 3 or 4 day retreat that was held in Melbourne. And it was the first time that we'd actually heard what the difference was between an invitation and a provocation. And it was very, very simple. An invitation is something that is kind, and a provocation is something that makes you think. So I thought that's a beautiful way of describing it without going into a whole heap of philosophical details, as our colleagues in Reggio tend to do, which is great if you have a deep understanding of it, but you get a bit lost, I think, if you're not used to that way of thinking and speaking and listening. So I guess mainly what I see in early childhood centres is invitations for play rather than provocations for play. And an invitation is where educators and teachers would set up a prompt for children to engage in play, whereas a provocation is, generally speaking, something that is ongoing, where we are connecting back to previous thinking. The educator might propose a curious question or a question of wondering. So I think what we see is an invitation rather than a provocation.
Okay, so let's say that you were to go in, into a family daycare educator's house, and you walked out of there and go, that was beautiful. They had so many wonderful invitations to play set up. What would you expect what sorts of things would you expect to see?
Lisa, the one thing I'd be looking for to start with would be, are the experiences and spaces for children really clear? So if I go in as a child, would I be very clear as to what was around me, what I was being invited to do? I'm thinking more and more about this in all early childhood settings, that perhaps our intention, and if we connect that to the early years learning framework, perhaps our intention is not quite clear, and therefore our expectations may also not be quite clear for children. In addition to that, I would expect to see open-ended resources, those which do not suggest to a child, this is what you do with me, rather suggesting to a child, what can you do with me? So a range of resources and materials, and yes, natural materials have a great space or great place in these spaces, but I don't want people to think just replacing plastic with timber is going to do the trick. It's really about thinking, what is my intention when I'm offering these things to children, whether it's in construction area or the baby play area or the domestic play area, or even what I call now transformational play, which in traditional speak would be dress-ups, but offering open-ended materials for that transformation of character, that transformation of identity. So open-ended materials, really clear intention and expectation.
Let's take that dress up. What's an open-ended material in the context of dress-ups, and what's a closed material in the context of dress-ups?
Okay. If you think about a costume, let's pick Elsa from Frozen, for example. And when I put on that costume, I can immediately become Elsa. But the transformation is quite quick, and I've had no input into thinking about what would it mean to transform myself into Elsa. But what if I was offered a range of beautiful silky blue materials, some sheer materials, a range of shoes, that I could then have a look at those and then think about, how can I transform myself into the character I wish to be, or into the identity I wish to be, by using this range of resources that's been offered to me? So how would I fold a dress to make it in the same vein as what the dress that Elsa wears? How could I use the combination of the silky material and the sheer material together? How would I get the crown on my head? How would I get the floaty sleeves? So it's really about slowing down that transformation for children. And there's the intentionality for educators to come in with questions about, well, how would you fold that? How would we clip that together? How would the soft material go with the transparent material? How would we get that crown to sit on your head? So it's about offering something that slows it down, gives an opportunity for educators and children to sit in dialogue with each other to make that transformation. So the child's actively engaging in it rather than just popping on the costume and off we go.
Okay, what about, say, if you saw a provocation or an invitation that was art-based in an educator's house that you thought, wow, that's really good? What would you see there?
In family daycare, I suppose it's a little bit trickier because you can have a very wide range of age groups of children. So you might have an infant up to just before school. But what I'd like to see educators thinking about in an arts space is, first of all, do the children understand, if we just take drawing and painting as an example, do children understand the relationships between the mark maker, the medium, and the surface? So the mark maker is your paintbrush, for example, and very young children would just use the paintbrush, stick it in their mouth. When they're finished with that, they might be banging it. Then they might be introduced to a medium. And instead of it being paint, think about it as being water, because water tastes different than the dry brush. And when you whack it onto the table or the floor, there might be little spotlets of water that come up. And then the child perhaps might lose interest in that, which is an indication of perhaps introducing a surface, which could be the paintbrush, the water, and the concrete or the bricks outside. So the child understands what the role is between each of those three things. And then we can start to introduce paint, for example, and different surfaces such as perspex or paper. So I'd like to see that there are a range of opportunities for children to explore these things, but to understand the relationship between those three things, the paintbrush, the medium, and the surface, so that we're less likely, I won't say don't, but we're less likely to have those experiences where the child is completely covered in paint. There's paint all over the floor and it turns out to be a big mess, and the educator says, perhaps I won't do that again for a couple of days because it's just too much trouble.
Deborah, I took this off your Instagram feed. I don't know whether everyone will be able to see it there, but it's a very beautiful setup art arrangement which has some plants in vases, different, 4 pieces of paper looking at each other. I don't even know what these things are in the middle, and a few textures at each one. Is that, can you talk me through that?
Okay, I'm not sure which one you are referring to there, but I'm going to have a stab. And okay. What I think it is about a mark making experience that's offered to children every day. So I think it's not paper on the table, they are tiles. And what we would be using would be felt tip pens on the markers on those tiles. And the reason why we do that is, once again, we go back to that idea of the mark maker, the medium, and the surface. And what we've discovered with young children, that if we use a surface such as a tile, it's a lot smoother than paper, and the mark maker will travel more quickly across that surface. So we often see children really focusing then on the marks that they're making. So it's not so much about what I can draw, it's about the marks I make. You might also see on that photo, I think, that there'll be a cloth or something like that close by where the children are practicing their mark making, which means that they can wipe the tile off and they can practice again. They can wipe the tile off and they can practice again until they're happy with what they've marked, made, drawn, written, whatever it is. The provocation in the middle is not so much about draw me, but it's about creating a beautiful space for children. It's about providing an opportunity for, particularly around the arts, particularly around drawing and painting, that if you think about what artists use, out there in the real world, they are attracted to beauty, and they may not necessarily be drawing the whole landscape. They might just be drawing the tree or the flower in front of them, but they immerse themselves in beauty. And that's one of the things that I think is really important for us as educators, to provide opportunities for children, not just the drawing or the mark making as in this case, but to ensure that the invitation that is offered to them is an invitation that is infused with beauty. I hope I've got the right one that you're looking at. But
yeah, it's exactly that one. Yeah. One of the things, like, I really love your Instagram page, and I'll provide people with a link for that.
Thank you.
Because it isn't instructive to educators, and it's not like those horrible Pinterest things where you get overwhelmed with, we could do this and we could do that. I often see, though, educators setting up elaborate setups for children, and I'd call them, they're not so much provocations or invitations, more like activity areas for children to work in. And I see that the educator is expressing their creativity in setting it up, but they're not necessarily thinking about how children will engage with that space. Is that something you see sometimes? Or
yes, I see that a lot, Lisa. And again, it comes back to what I was saying before about really understanding what your intention is when you are developing, or what I call curating, a space for children. An example might be, this was in an infant studio last week, and a junior studio, which has children 15, 18 months through to about 3. And the educators had called it the sound corner. So there were lots of big, lots and lots of big tins. There were lots of jars with a whole range of things in them, with the intention that the children would use these to make noise with, make sound with. But as we were watching the children, what we saw was the children were filling up the big tins from the smaller tins and then carting them away, and then bringing them back and tipping them out, then filling them up and carting them away, and that kind of thing. And what I'd like to suggest to our colleagues in family daycare is around understanding the schemas that children are working on. So, schemas such as transporting, which is what these children were doing. Just all they wanted to do was fill things up, take them somewhere and bring them back again. Or enclosing, which might mean enclosing themselves, getting inside a cupboard, those sorts of things. Because when you understand that the schemas that children are working on, which is a fairly foundational child development kind of knowledge, it's not an unattainable knowledge, you then can start to set up things for children that support this, what is theory development for children. How does this work? How do I fit with this? What would happen if I just fill this jar up and take it over there? And I think sometimes we overwhelm children with way too much stuff when we could really simplify it, take it back to basics, and start to think about What are the children exploring here? What are they trying to understand? What are they trying to connect to in terms of the world around them? Another example might be something that I see is book corners or library corners, I suppose, that have got tons and tons of books in them. And it's very difficult for children's brains, especially younger children under the age of 3, to kind of sort out what's what. But if you think about it, my intention is for children to connect with storybooks, books reading for pleasure. But before they can do that, they have to understand what a book is. And they also need to understand the expectation that the books are not to be left all over the floor, to be trodden on or torn or whatever it is. So setting up a library space or a book nook or a book corner, whatever you'd like to call it, with just a few books on it, and perhaps the very special ones, the pop-up ones, the very, very beautiful books that we need to take care of could be sat up high on a shelf where children could indicate, I would really like you to read this book to me, which means I would like some time just with you, just for myself. So it's not so much about the reading, it's about connecting to relationships. So again, it comes back, what is your intention when you're offering children these things? And often, Lisa, less is best, quality over quantity.
Well, you must see, like, I know you work a lot more with centres than with home-based educators, but you must see some really beautiful, educationally beautiful, not physically beautiful, provocations and invitations set up by educators. Could you, thinking back through your memory, talk about some of the things, that have really, that you thought that the educators were thinking deeply about the children that they were working with?
Standing in the doorstep of a family day care home, or standing on the doorstep of a kindergarten, I'd be looking for exactly the same thing. And the first thing I would be looking for is, what does this environment say to me as a child that I am welcome? So how do I see myself when I walk through that door or I stand on the doorstep and look in? Because it's really important, I think, for children to have a connection. If you think about the very first day that they're there, or something I can keep coming back to that connects me. And it might be something really simple, such as I saw in an infant studio the other day, the rubber duckies that are in children have in the bath. And They had this little stand with all these little rubber duckies on with their names on them and their photos underneath, because the children obviously are yet to read. But the first thing that the children did was went and got one of these rubber duckies, and they held on to it as they came into the studio, and they put the duck into a pond. No water in it, pretend pond. They put the duck into the pond, which was like the very young child saying, hello, I'm here. And they actually had something to do when they got there. So getting that little sense of security. And I came in and I popped it in the pond. When they leave in the afternoon, they take it out of the pond and they go outside and they put it back on the beautiful little stand. Really simple things like that just say to a child, hello, you belong. There's their name or their photograph. They've got something to do as soon as they get there. They're not kind of going, which educator is going to come and get me? They're actually more focused on that. So really simple things like that when educators are thinking about how children make that transition from mum and dad or nan and pop or their carer into the home or into the centre, we've really got to think about how they're making that transition in their head from being a member of a family to being a member of a learning community, which is what a family day care home is. It's a learning community. So how can we help children make that transition? The other thing that I would look for that really makes my heart sing is the way in which the educators have thought about sustainability And by that, I mean, how have they repurposed furniture? How are they ensuring that they're upholding a sustainability policy? And yes, around things like the use of water and lights and things like that. But how are they moving towards sustainability in terms of things like adhesives and glue and those sorts of things that you can't replace once you've stuck the paper on the cardboard or whatever it is, that's it. So I'd be looking for how is a child welcomed, and around the sustainability issues that I think we really have a ethical and moral responsibility for helping children understand, you know, how do we support our planet, even, you know, big things like that, but do it in really, really small ways.
The last topic that we did in this series was on sustainability, so hopefully everyone's going out there and putting those ideas into practice.
Yeah.
Within the context of a family daycare educator's home, I often see photos where every child is and like we've got a maximum of 4 children under school age. So all 4 children would be working on the one, would be engaged in the one activity. Is that, would you expect to see in a house that was set up, or a home that was set up, with good provocations, good invitations, would you expect to see all children working on the same activity at the same time, or would you expect to see a few separate ones happening?
Yeah, I think I would expect to see a combination of both. If we look at the early years learning framework, or perhaps the national quality framework, which is the framework we work under, one of the things that we have drawn from that is that we know that children learn, as they interact with people, places, and things. So it is around opportunities throughout the day to work in small groups, and family daycare is just such an awesome possibility of doing that. However, it's not to say that children want to be doing something with others all day, every day, working on the same thing. So perhaps our colleagues in family daycare could think about opportunities for children to be able to work together, but also many more opportunities for children to work on different things as their requirements allow. The other thing too is, I think, in a family daycare situation where you've perhaps got a 15-month-old through to a 4.5-year-old, it is quite tricky to have things that enable all the children to work together. But, things like a mud kitchen, for example, are a great opportunity for children to work together, or potion play or perfume play, or things that are really open-ended where each child has a possibility, or maybe using clay where the younger child is working more on the muscle development in their upper body, where a 4.5-year-old might have the capacity to make little things out of the clay. So we've got to think about, if we want all the children to be working together, is their ability to work along a line of possibilities here for younger children and older children. So I think, Lisa, a combination, and opportunities for children to just be by themselves for a bit, because it's highly stressful for children to be in an environment with others all day. So those different opportunities would be very important.
So talk to me about craft. What's your feelings about craft in education care settings?
Oh, that's a really interesting question, Lisa. And it's even the words to me sound like it comes out of the 1960s, that word craft. But what I'd like to do is connect it back to our conversation earlier about sustainability. And I'd really like all educators to think about moving away from what I call make and take. So we give children, I don't know, a stencil or a piece of cardboard that has a drawing on it, and we have an expectation that they'll fill in the gaps for us. They'll put hair on it, or because it's a face, or it's a bird, or something like that. To really thinking about how we can be sustainable with those sorts of things as well. So I've come up with this, well, it's not such a new idea now, but I've tried to move away from that idea of make and take and to move into what I call transient art, which means that it's not fixed. So the opportunity for children to work on a surface, and educators that I'm working with at the moment will often use an empty photo frame, picture frame kind of thing, you know, like about that big. And they have a range of materials and resources in front of them, which could be anything from, you know, glass pebbles to sticks to ribbon to, you know, the world's your oyster in terms of what the materials could be. But children begin then to understand about patterning, how they can make patterns with these things. And they then might turn into pictures of things, you know, a landscape or a person or an animal. But the great thing about that is that they then need to put those things back in their right place, in the bowl or the basket or wherever they come from. So they're learning about matching and how you seriate things, how things go into patterns. And it's sustainable because it's not permanent. That you can take a photograph of it so that the child has a memory of it if they need to. But I'd really like educators to move away from this idea of craft because it is unsustainable. And often those craft things come out of a catalogue, which means that you've also spent money on this stuff. Whereas you could take the children for a walk to the local park and with baskets and collect beautiful leaves and pods and sticks and stuff like that and bring it back. But you can have a beautiful surface to work on. So it could be a really beautiful old picture frame and the children develop their pattern or their picture inside of that frame, but it's not stuck onto something. It's not something I'm going to take home. And I remember as a preschool teacher myself, with parents that be doing the face planting, not another piece of craft to take home. Can we just leave it here? So that idea of sustainability, I think, comes in with all of this stuff, but it's around children understanding that it's not about this make and take because it happens in about 2 seconds and they're gone, but really understanding that sustainability can be part of your everyday life when you're at your family daycare home.
And what about one of the things that I often see people like you post is examples of light being used within education care settings? Can you tell me, like, you know, reflection and can you talk to me about that a bit?
That's a really tricky language to work with, that light, shadow and reflection. And I think one of the things that we need to understand as human beings, and children obviously are human beings, but we tend to only see light from above. The light comes down onto us because that's usually where our lights are in our rooms. That's where the sun is. The sun is up here, the lights are up here, and the light comes down upon us. And that's how we make, you know, shadows on the ground and those sorts of things. But there are lots of different forms of light, and things like light boxes, for example, which are quite popular in many early childhood settings, some of which perhaps don't know how to use them effectively because they're next to a window or, you know, a doorway or something. But those sorts of things then allow children to understand what light looks like when it comes up underneath something. And it might pass through a piece of coloured perspex, or so it looks quite different from underneath than it does from on top. And then we have the good old-fashioned, many of our listeners may not know what an old-fashioned overhead projector is, but back in the day when we used to put transparencies on them, and we do our classes with the transparencies. But what I love about that light is it comes from behind and shines through, which is really tricky, because when you're working with that sort of light, you're working on the glass surface of the projector, but you can actually see what you're doing up there on the wall. So that coordination kind of thing is really tricky. So that's the reason why we would use light and shadow. The reflection piece, I think, is really interesting when you're using things like mirrors, those sort of balls that you can get, the kind of flat spheres that you can get, is around the child connecting with themselves, because you can actually obviously see yourself in the mirror. And for human beings, I guess, all of us, whether we're a child or an adult, we don't often see what our face looks like in public when we're with others. We can see our hands moving, we can see our legs moving, but the one place that we can't see is our face. And we use the reflection, whether it's the mirror or the ball, or when I'm talking to someone else, what I say, I can see from their reaction, whether they think it's funny or sad, or they're shocked or whatever it is. So that light and shadow, you can move with, you can think about that with the lights around us. But reflection is something quite interesting, and how very young children learn to understand that what they see in front of them is actually themselves. And I guess our listeners and watchers today will, that they would have seen a little person going up to a mirror and kissing the mirror because they think it's another person. And that's really interesting to watch. So that light.
Sadly, I think that children that have been in lockdown and doing Zooms with their educators would be a lot more used to seeing their own reflection back at them.
Exactly. And my granddaughter, who is 18, our only grandchild, but she's 18 months of age, lives in Thirroul, south of Sydney. And she's so used to offering me cups of tea like this, and I'll take a sip and she takes a sip, or she's putting a boot on and I'm putting a boot on. I'm sure she thinks that all of her relatives, both up here in Queensland and in the United Kingdom, just they live like this. So yeah, who knows what light, shadow and reflection will look like in a few years' time when they're in preschool.
One of the things that I think educators can often be a bit scared of is of doing something differently than how they've always done it, trying something differently. If you were not used to setting up deliberate provocations or invitations, if you were more used to going, okay, there's the toys, there's the dress-up toys, there's the whatever, how would you slowly bring that into your practice?
I guess I would think about what is it that we've always done in early childhood. So we've always done things like we have to have a sand pit, we have to have Play-Doh, we have to have dress-ups, because that's what we've always done. But how about we rethink what we've always done? So let me give you just one example. So, okay, we've always had Play-Doh. Forever and a day in early childhood, we've always had Play-Doh. But what if we didn't have Play-Doh? Would the sky fall in, like Henny Penny said? Would the world come crashing down around us if we didn't have Play-Doh? But we've got to think about, okay, if we were going to be really brave and courageous and not have Play-Doh anymore, we really have to think about the whys that sit behind it. So why would we want to replace Play-Doh, for example, with clay? So one of the things that I'd like our colleagues to think about is we go back to that sustainability idea, that Play-Doh is made out of food. And as yet, we can't recycle the Play-Doh. We can't give it to the chickens. Generally speaking, depending on where you live, up here it goes really moldy within a few days because of the humidity. Down south, it gets really crackly and horrible, and you can't use it. So that's ecologically, that's one thing. Ethically is another thing. So the ethics are the decisions that you make that perhaps make you feel a bit uncomfortable. So, for example, because Play-Doh is made out of food, and right here in Australia right now, and this is a really good time to be thinking about this, is a lot of our families do not have enough food to feed themselves, to feed their parents, to feed their children. So why would we be offering food to children to play with? And if our listeners and watchers today are anything like me as a parent, one of the things I always said to my children at mealtimes was, don't play with your food. So we've got all of these things, yet I see time and time again children being offered food to play with, whether it's making potato prints or whether it's Play-Doh or whether it's what did I see the other day? Cutting up oranges and, I don't know, drying them and hanging them off mobiles or whatever the latest trendy thing is. But again, I've got to think out, we've always done that, but that doesn't mean we should always do it. We've always had Play-Doh. It doesn't mean we should always do it. So if I was going to be a brave and courageous person in family daycare, I would choose something that really makes me think about the why. Why do we do this? And what could we offer that is even better for children? And clay is much better for children than when Play-Doh is, purely from a developmental point of view. The other thing about Play-Doh is it has no memory. You can't come back to play with it day in again. You can't start to make something with Play-Doh and add to it as you go along during the week. It hasn't got that memory, whereas clay does. And the other thing to think about is what would be better for children's development if I was going to change anything. And what we know about clay, for example, is it builds those muscles in the hands that children need to be able to eventually go like that and make marks and begin to write. So if I was going to be brave and courageous and change things, I'd start with something like Play-Doh. That would be my go-to. And then I'd do sand pits and swings and forts. But let's just start with Play-Doh.
It sounds like a good place to start. And if people wanted to learn more about provocations, what do you think would be a good place for people to start?
Well, my Instagram is a good place to start if they just want to have a read through, because I try and put the why with everything that I put on there, so they don't just use it as a Pinterest thing and go, well, that looks great. But I think having a network that they can talk to, a network of other family daycare providers, but maybe not even just family daycare, maybe connecting with your local early learning centre or something around that way. But I've always found having a group of people around me that I can talk to, that I could share ideas with, particularly things that are making me feel uncomfortable, that maybe there's a different way of doing this. Reading, there's lots and lots, I guess, for the family daycare teams, books like Margie Carter and Deb Curtis, their books. They've got some amazing, really easily accessible reading. It's not academic. It's not full of theory and stuff like that. So their books are really good. And Lisa, I don't know if you remember Ursula Colby. She used to be at Macquarie University, and her books are just beautiful. They're really accessible around the arts, if you will, and they're really good places to start, because Ursula like Margie Carter and Deb Curtis, they kind of just make you think a little bit about, oh, what if I did it this way? What if I thought about it this way?
One of the things that educators, family daycare educators really have, I think, is a really good understanding of the children. Like, they have such intimate knowledge of each of the children that they've been caring with, some of whom they've had from, 6 weeks old up until school age. How does it help when you really know what your children are like, who those children are? How does that help in setting up provocations for them?
That's a really good question. And I'm just trying to think. So little Asta, who I was talking about before, our granddaughter, she goes to a family daycare in Thirroul, and she talks about her family daycare educator all the time. So it's really easy to see that there is a very strong, trusting relationship that goes on between an 18-month-old and her educator. I think what it can do, and I'm going to use a term here that perhaps your educators might not have heard before, and it's called the zone of proximal development. And that basically means this is where the children are starting over here, and this is where you'd like to get the children to. And when you know children really well, it's quite easy to move children through the skills that they would need to have to get them to where you want to go, whether you're talking about the outcomes in the EYLF or some goals that you and the family have set for the children. When you've got a small group of children who you know really well, you can actually, I think you can move the children through their learning at, I'm going to say faster pace, but I don't mean hot housing the children as if they're a plant. I mean, you can, because you're with them all of the time, you can really, I guess, advance their learning because you have that deep relationship with them and within that, in that small group. And working closely with the family who you see every day. It's not like you've got, I work with studios where they have 66 children in the studio with lots and lots of educators, but no one would know the children as well as a family daycare educator would with that small group of children. So I think that knowledge that you have of the children is exceptional in terms of being able to support the child's learning, particularly around language development, and those sorts of things. I think is exceptional in family daycare settings.
Okay, I think that's probably enough. We could keep everyone here all night talking, but I think that's probably as much. Is there anything else you'd like to say specifically to our listeners as educators, as family daycare educators?
I think you're in a awesome environment to be able to. I have this mantra, and it's called "Nothing Without the Child," and I'm hoping that our colleagues in family daycare would be engaging children in everyday life, things like setting the table and cleaning up after themselves and being able to put their own sunscreen on and get their own hat. So if you can involve the children in everyday life where they're learning real life skills alongside of those other learning opportunities that you're offering, I think it shows children how they can participate in the world around them, and that we're doing things with children instead of to children. That would be what I would offer them.
That sounds like a pretty good note to finish on. Thank you very much, Deborah. You're
very welcome, Lisa. It was lovely to talk to you again.
Well, I'm sure you were as inspired as me. There's so many ideas in what Deborah and Lisa were talking about. That really important message at the end about nothing without children is an invitation for all of us, I think, to be able to engage in thinking about the experiences that you're offering on a daily basis, figure out where the opportunities are to open up those spaces so that they are more about provocation and engagement in stimulating environments that get children to think, not just do. And do you love the way that Deborah's giving us really practical ideas as well as really deep thinking? So she's introducing some really great theoretical platforms here. Lots of you have been talking to each other on the chat, which is fantastic. And of course, those people who are joining us as a podcast, I'm sure there's lots of ideas that you've been noting down as you've been hearing the things we talked about at the beginning. And also, of course, the ideas that we've been hearing from Deborah's conversation with Lisa. So I know that there are probably questions that you have in terms of engaging in that space. And one of the questions that I have is about, can you get it wrong? And I think the idea here would be to experiment, to try new things, to see what you think about things, talk to your team as well, get them to come and give you some feedback, get the feedback from the children as well. I'm not sure you can completely get it wrong. I think it's much more about experimenting and thinking about different ways of doing things, taking a little bit of inspiration from some of the different ways that we've been talking about here, some of the things that you can see online, check out the Instagram posts, find out what might work for you, put it into practice, and then reflect on it. Think about, does this work? Is this opening up questions for children? Is it opening up their thinking, or is it closing it down? So really think about those opportunities. And I really like the fact that Lisa and Deborah were talking about the fact that there are lots of practical things just in every day that you can use. So it doesn't have to be too grand, and it can be about recycling, as Deborah said, looking after the planet at the same time as stimulating children's thinking. So lots of you are in fierce agreement online. Some of you are saying that's fantastic. So here's what I'd like you to do as a result of our conversation today. I'd love you to go back onto the Facebook page and check out the conversation there. So go back in there in the next couple of days. Make sure you do the survey, because that's really important. It gives us a really good sense of what you're interested in, what you like, what you think we're going to be really helpful into the future. There is lots of opportunities for you to contribute ideas, share some things. If you haven't already joined the Facebook page, go into Facebook and put PD in your pocket in the search section, and it'll come up in that space. And of course, this session has been funded through a collaboration with New South Wales Department of Education Sector Development Program, and we need your feedback so that we can share that with the department, and hopefully there'll be more opportunities into the future. Thanks everybody for your participation tonight. Thanks everybody who's joining us as a podcast later on. We hope these ideas have inspired and helped you think creatively about your everyday work with children and their families. Thank you and good night.